Melinda. Awesome. Great to see you as well, as always.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. I'm your host, Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. This series goes deep and gets real. We're building empathy for underrepresented and historically marginalized people and providing tangible, actionable steps that we can all take to be better allies and advocates for each other. On screen, we have Jasmine, an ASL interpreter today. The ASL interpretation is sponsored by Interpreter Now, which is a deaf-owned company we're proud to partner with. So today we're discussing intergenerational trauma and its impact in the workplace. Please welcome Michael Thomas, shareholder at Ogletree Deakins. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
This has been a tough couple of weeks, and I just want to spend a moment to acknowledge the lives that have been lost due to systemic racism and police brutality. I am angry and have a lot of feelings, and I know a lot of you out there do as well. And one of the key pieces of this is to not let this be just a moment, but let this be something that motivates us to do action and to correct systemic racism and police brutality and a lack of inclusion across all of our many different facilities. So I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the place that we're in, and that this conversation is about healing, about what we can do within ourselves and what we can do for each other. So on that note, Michael, can you tell us a bit about your story and how you came to do the work you do?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Melinda, for having me, and also for that introduction. I think we often just try to jump into things without making sure that we're emotionally prepared or that we've given ourselves the tools to keep ourselves safe, during that difficult conversation. So thank you for that introduction. So as Melinda mentioned, I'm a shareholder at a law firm called Ogletree Deakins, and we're a global management side labor and employment firm. And I do a lot of wage and hour class action, but I'm also part of our diversity and inclusion practice group. So I spend a lot of time with different companies on how to set up a legally compliant diversity and inclusion practice. And I also do some kind of one-on-one coaching in that area as well. But I think one of the main questions that you asked, Melinda, is really, how do I get to this point in my life and my career where I'm doing this type of D&I work? And really, I came to doing D&I work just based on my own life experiences with race-based trauma, and really trying to understand why I constantly felt unsafe in predominantly white environments. And I'll try to keep this short, but it might be a little bit lengthy. Is that, I went to a Catholic grade school. My brother and sister and I were, for most of the time that we were there, the only African-American family. The college and law school that I went to were predominantly white, and I've largely worked in the private sector and largely predominantly white environment. So most of my life experience is being one of few African-Americans, and in that given environment. And the thing about trauma, so trauma is really, it's an event that is so serious that it inhibits your ability to cope with what's going on around you. And it impacts you in that given moment, and it also impacts you moving into the future. So for example, if you think of someone that 5 years ago experienced a car accident, 5 years later in the present, that person, when they hear a car screech, their body will feel tight, their breath might get short. In essence, they're actually reliving or replaying that experience that they experienced 5 years ago, because your body actually remembers that. And the thing that's important there is that, trauma, and I'll talk about intergenerational trauma later, is not just this cognitive experience. It has to do with the body being reset to interpret the world as being a dangerous place. And that reset occurs in your brain, your nervous system, and also in your connective tissue. And what I learned as an adult based on real traumatic experiences that were race-based, based on messaging received over a period of time, is that when I was in predominantly white environments, I would physically and mentally go through a traumatic experience where my body would feel tight, my breath would feel short, and mentally, I would go in fight or flight mode. And largely what that was based on is, again, it's those life lessons where I learned that my skin color could lead others to cause me harm without reason or explanation, and therefore being in probably white environments became an environment that was unpredictable and therefore didn't feel safe. However, at the same time, I was socialized to assume that whiteness was the norm and the standard to follow and strive towards. And so I learned at an early age that if I wanted to function to be successful in navigating society, I had to learn to navigate white society in a way that I would not be perceived as being Black. So in that regard, I learned how to hide and not actually even see myself. And so what I ultimately was learning is that in order for me to move freely or navigate in society, my freedom of mobility was conditioned. My freedom of movement was conditioned upon white approval of my behavior. So don't question, don't speak loud, know your place. I also learned that even if I was in an environment and engaging in a way that would meet white approval, I could still be subject to some type of adverse treatment based on my race. So let me kind of give you an example of what I mean by that. There was I think Melinda was actually at one of your tech inclusion conferences. One of the speakers talked about how it was at a tech company and they invited high school students in. And there were a group of white high school students that came from a private school that went to the tech company. And when they got off the elevator, they had multiple tables of, just grab bags and gifts, for these students. And so when this group of white students got off the elevator, they immediately rushed to these tables and started grabbing these grab bags. They also had invited on a different day a group of youth of color from an inner city school. And as soon as that group of youth of color got off the elevator, they stopped and they paused. They didn't do anything. They're aware and they're used to being watched and they're used to being unwelcome. And they're used to not having access to move freely unless they have permission, right? So they were then given permission to grab these grab bags, which they did. But even as they're grabbing these different grab bags, they're doing it very cautiously because they're mindful of the fact that even if they have permission in that moment, that permission can be revoked at any point in time based on something that is very unpredictable. And so, in essence, kind of like what I learned in many ways is that my body in some ways can be a source of harm. And I know this is a long way of answering your question, but in law school, I had a professor named Anthony Farley. And he taught constitutional law, and he wrote a law review article called Black Body Fetish Object. And in his article, what he talks about is how the Black body is often the site where dominant white culture places its social ills. So poor education, poor healthcare, poor water, access to housing, all those social ills often gets placed on Black culture. And the fact that, dominant white culture has a place to place those social ills, that suffering actually is also a source of pleasure or gratification for dominant culture. And so one way of thinking about that is the idea that somebody could say, well, I may be poor, but at least I'm not Black, right? Like that actually kind of gives a certain level of gratification, and I'm not that one thing. And so the Black body becomes this space that of both power and pleasure, and a source of, in some ways, unpredictable harm. So for me, when I realized these patterns in my life of not feeling safe, and the tendency is when you don't feel safe in your environment, it means that your mind is in a very hypervigilant state. So your body physically gets tight, your brain actually goes into fight or flight mode. You start releasing hormones and cortisol, and you're not physically present in your given environment because you're looking around to make sure that you can keep yourself safe. But you can't necessarily always fight or flight. So, part of what I used to do when I would experience that discomfort in the body is what most people do when they experience discomfort from trauma is they find things that mask that level of discomfort. So food can be a way of masking. Alcohol can be a way of masking. Abuse of power can be a way of masking. Um, and so I realized that these habits and patterns were just unhealthy and involved a lot of self-harm in a variety of ways. And so for me, my response to that was not, oh, I need to read more or take a class or anything like that. It was ultimately, I need to reclaim my Black body, because that's the thing that has been taken from me for other people to, in some ways, utilize or benefit from. And so my process to do that was actually to take yoga classes and ultimately get a yoga certification. And what yoga ultimately allows me to do is really for the first time in my life to pause and look at my body in a way where I couldn't, catastrophize. That I'm looking at my body and my mind might say, don't stay with this discomfort because you've experienced harm, or there's emotional scarring there, or that's going to trigger some kind of traumatic response. When you're in yoga, you just have to stay in your posture. You can't really move, and you focus on your breath. And in doing so, you actually train yourself for greater self-regulation. And for me, that was the beginning on actually reclaiming my body. And so, as I was able to do that, it empowered me to say, yeah, this D&I work is incredibly important because people of color and also, white people as well that have gone through traumatic events are constantly being triggered in the workplace. And that prevents those intimate, honest interactions that we need to have to actually really heal and come together. So that, I know that's a long way of answering your question, but that's how I ultimately got to doing this work.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. So you mentioned our events, and the first time I think you talked at one of our events was in 2016 at an Inclusion 2.0 event where we were talking about the intersection of mindfulness and inclusion. It was only a 10-minute talk, but it has fundamentally changed my perception of racism and trauma. And so I'm really excited. I think it's really important to have this conversation and to have this conversation with as wide of an audience as possible. So first off, I acknowledged a little bit, but I want to make very clear that this week and every time there's a police killing of a Black person, that people are not just protesting and angry about one death. And though the one death is a tragedy, George Floyd, Briana Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pup, Ahmaud Arbery, people are protesting because they're angry about centuries of systemic racism and injustice. It's that intergenerational happening over generations and generations. So Michael, can you tell us what you mean about intergenerational trauma and why we need to address it?
Yeah, no, sure. So I mentioned the definition of trauma a little bit earlier, and kind of talked about it in a way that explains that trauma is not just a cognitive experience. It actually impacts your connective tissues to the point where even though it's something that you experienced years ago, you can still experience that event today. And Joy DeGruy in her novel Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome speaks very eloquently about intergenerational trauma. So that's a great resource for a lot of people, including myself. And so intergenerational trauma can best be described as harm that was externally experienced by one generation that now lives inside subsequent generations. And so the main example that I think about, specifically coming from the African American experience, is the generation that is brought over to this country as property, and they're separated, from their family. They're disconnected to the body, because again, that body is a source of pain, and that body is also a source of inviting harm onto other people. Meaning, if during slavery, if an African American man wanted to have a wife, the property owner might separate that relationship. So my desire to form connection with an African American female for a family structure could actually be a source of inviting harm upon that other person. So that experience to the next generation that's post-slavery, that deals with just overt racism and violence geared towards African American that's not protected by the law, to separate but equal, to Jim Crow, to voter suppression, to lynching, to the generation that faces new and more subtle forms of Jim Crow, that faces race-based inequities based on healthcare, housing, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline. These are all, real external experiences that get passed down over a period of time. And then what comes along with that is that sense of fear that I mentioned before about engaging in predominant white culture and being seen as being Black, because that recognition of skin color can invite harm to you. That also gets passed down from generation to generation. So let me give you a couple of examples of that, from my own life experience, and then I'll connect that to my own experience with intergenerational trauma. And again, the large definition is it's this external event that was experienced by one generation that gets passed down, that subsequently lives within subsequent generations. So I was in law school during the O.J. Simpson trial, which I know totally dates me. But I can recall being, and I went to Boston College for law school, and I was in our student union when the verdict came out, and I was the only African American that was there. And I can recall in that moment, when the verdict came out that was not guilty, I didn't want to celebrate because I initially agreed with the outcome, but I agreed with the fact that this was this moment where an African American male could possibly get justice in our criminal justice system. So in that given moment, when that result came out, I think we were watching CNN, and CNN had a picture of the courtroom, and also had a picture of Howard University and their student union. And so when the verdict came out, the courtroom was like absolutely silent. Some people were stunned by the verdict, and the students at Howard University, cheered. And so me being that only African American in that environment, in a very split second, I said to myself, if I cheer or celebrate the way that I want to right now, I will out myself as being Black. And this environment of potential colleagues and coworkers and relationships in the future, all of a sudden are going to view me as being different. And this environment is going to become very hostile. So again, in that given moment, I'm in that fight or flight mode. The body becomes horribly uncomfortable, and I'm unsafe in an environment just within a split second, right? And what I do, I freeze, right? I just experience that discomfort in the body. Another example is, I went to Bucknell University for college, which is a prominent white college in North Central Pennsylvania. And I can recall my first day of class, actually going into the classroom environment and thinking very clearly, there's no Black people here, this environment's racist. And when you have a thought in your head, there's a tendency to look for things that affirm that belief. So I walk into a classroom environment, somebody makes eye contact with me, and my initial response is they're looking at me because I'm Black. And it's the same exact process. The body becomes tight, breath becomes short, my mind becomes very hypervigilant, because I'm not perceiving the environment as being unsafe. body starts releasing hormones and cortisol, you name it. So then the question comes up, how as an adult in these given moments did I learn to freeze and perceive these environments that really externally nothing's actually occurring except for how I'm perceiving, right? So, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, raised by my mom, and my grandfather on my father's side of the family was one of the first African Americans to integrate the Steelworkers Union. And because of that, he had to fight, at work, external racism very hard. He was also one of the first African Americans to purchase a home in a certain neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And because of that, in his home environment, he had to fight external racism in a very difficult way. And so he became this very hard, unemotional man because in his worldview, as an African American man, you couldn't show emotions. It shows vulnerability, and people take advantage of you. That was his way of responding to racism once you shut down, not connect with the emotions in the body. He had the same expectations of my father, and my father responded to that level of racism and feeling uncomfortable in the body by being an alcoholic. That's how he chose to mask that level of discomfort. So I grew up in the same exact environment where the message to me was, don't connect with the body, don't show vulnerability. It's a sign of weakness. As African American male, people will take advantage of you. But at the same time, I also grew up with that messaging of you have to navigate white society, right? So that message of learning how to freeze is what was passed down to me because I couldn't show up in a way that showed vulnerability. People could take advantage of that. So what that ultimately really shows is that external experience of racism that my grandfather experienced, with people really physically outside of him saying things, there being signs, things like that. Now, as a kid, live within me as I navigated the world. I had the same exact fear. So that's really the concept of intergenerational trauma, as it gets passed down. And I think the other part of your question, Melinda, is why should we care? Why should we really care about intergenerational trauma? And it's really because there's a whole variety of different wounds that our country has experienced that we haven't really healed from. And what we're seeing a lot now are those various wounds that have been experienced within African American culture. And it's not just the big wound of the Oscar Grant on Bart or the Trayvon Martin. Those are all incredibly important, but it's the day-to-day microaggressions that really deepen that wound. So another example, and then I'll be done answering your question, I promise.
You're good.
Is not too long ago, I was having a conversation with another lawyer, and he was telling me about how his son is doing community service work, and in an inner city environment. And as he was telling the story, he pointed out that his son's only this 5'8", 160-pound white kid, and then he continues to tell the story about how his son's doing work in this inner city environment. And this is a coworker that's probably very liberal, probably voted for Obama, and but in that moment, the only reason for him to mention the weight of his son is to suggest that the environment is unsafe. The only reason for him to mention that, well, he also mentioned that his son was like the only white kid within like a 2-mile radius. The only reason for him to mention that is also to suggest that the environment was somehow, unsafe, and to kind of highlight, how bold or progressive his son is by being there. Now, in that moment, he doesn't mean to cause any harm by that statement. In part, he's probably even trying to connect with me in some ways. But in that moment, I realized that that's a microaggression, right? He doesn't intend it. So do I call the person out at that given moment? And then all of a sudden become the person that raises race all the time? Or do I stop or do I freeze, right? So these patterns of wound that have experienced and we see in these big events occur on a daily basis at this microaggression level. And the main reason that we need to actually talk about this is largely because we haven't healed from this trauma.
Yeah, and it's in and that it seems like that trauma also can be re-triggered even if you do work on it. You know, with the events, with the bigger events like we've seen in the last few weeks, and also with those microaggressions. I know that happens to me in the workplace for sure. Is that when I go into when I work with a client that really hasn't done much work on diversity and inclusion, and I'm shut down right away in different ways from different microaggressions. It brings back that fight or flight response that I thought I'd worked on, right? That I thought I had gotten over, and it can come back. It can re-trigger those things, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, like one of the main ways to really, kind of understand trauma, it goes back to really reclaiming your body, because that's what's causing that entire fight response. So, then that's really kind of where mindfulness and body awareness comes into play, is that mindfulness lets you pause and just become aware in this given moment, what your feelings are, that I'm feeling stress, that I'm feeling anxiety, that I'm feeling neglect, that I'm feeling hurt, without actually responding. Mindfulness just lets you observe that emotion and name it. And then if you can just learn to observe that emotion, you can also learn that in this moment, and so you observe that emotion and also learn to be present through mindfulness. You can learn that in this moment, I'm actually feeling okay. Even though all these other emotions are going on around me, anxiety, stress, whatever it might be, in this moment, I'm actually okay. And that lets you kind of identify what are your emotional triggers, what are the things that could put you in that fight or flight space, and then physically, what does that actually feel like in your body, right? Because again, if you can just learn to kind of observe those emotions and learn and observe those body sensations, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be completely healed from trauma, but you can engage in more self-regulation in that given moment. And which is one of the things that I think is really interesting about the the time frame that we're in right now, is that we both have the anxiety of a pandemic, and this race-based violence going on. And when you combine those two things, you get a really interesting dynamic. And what I mean by that is we don't have the escapes that we typically have, right? Like I could experience a form of trauma, or you could, watch this violence on TV and really connect with that. But then all of a sudden you can go watch sports, that can like take your mind away from something. Or you can go to this event, with your friends, or go to a bar, or whatever it might be. Here, we really are in a space where so many people are connecting with what's going on. And we're all kind of forced to sit with our discomfort. And as you sit with your discomfort, without having that opportunity to escape it, without having that opportunity to mask, you're more inclined to want to talk about it. You're more inclined to want to engage, because in part you have the time and space to do so, and you can't necessarily escape that discomfort that you're experiencing in the body.
So can you walk through a little bit? I think it's kind of two things. One is you have to work on yourself over time, and reclaiming, I'm sure, took a lot of time in your life. It wasn't just you took a few yoga classes. I think you went pretty deep there.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then there's also what you do in the moment to heal yourself, or to maybe just to remind yourself of that healing. And so what are those things that you have done to heal?
Yeah, so I talked briefly about taking yoga classes. And for me, like as Melinda suggested, I went pretty deeply into doing that, and actually got a yoga certification from the Naroga Institute, which is a yoga studio in Berkeley. and they focus on Raja Yoga. So that's Raja yoga, which is mindfulness yoga. And that's a way of understanding the stress and trauma that the body holds, and understanding that through body awareness and meditation and mindfulness, you're able to identify and potentially release some of that stress and trauma. And there's a really good book called The Body Keeps Score, by an author and researcher named Bessel van der Kolk, that really focuses on how through intergenerational trauma can actually be passed down through your connective tissue. So it can be passed on actually through the body, and yoga is one way of identifying that and releasing it. The other thing that I did was to get my yoga certification, I had to do 100 hours of yoga related community service work. And so I volunteered to work with the Prison Insight Project. And what the Prison Insight Project does is they go into different jails and prisons, and they run a restorative justice circle. So it's typically a group of incarcerated men, occasionally women, but typically it's just incarcerated men, are sitting in a circle talking about the harm that they've caused. And they also talk about the harm that they've experienced, often at a very young age in their life. And typically, when you've experienced some form of harm, again, your body is a source of harm, and your body doesn't feel safe. So when you experience that harm, one of the tendencies is to disconnect from your emotions in your body. And that can be done by masking whatever that discomfort is. But the larger point is that if you disconnect from your emotions in your body, it's hard to engage in self-care, and it's easy to do self-harm. And if you can lose that connection to your body and engage in self-harm, it becomes really easy to cause harm to other people. And we can talk about that maybe later on the podcast, because that dynamic of challenges with forming empathy to self and leading to cause harm to other people plays itself out in the workplace a fair amount. But my role with the restorative justice circle, was I helped center the guys as they would sit around this restorative justice circle, by helping them become fully focused on their body and their breath and being present in that given moment. Even though they've come from jail cells and things like that, that in and of itself can be a traumatic event. And so what I learned just from observing these bold men talk about, really serious, egregious harms that they have physically experienced, and then egregious harms that they've caused to other people, is that you can heal. But that healing process really involves connecting with those deep wounds and scars that we hold in our bodies, forgiving ourselves for engaging in self-harm for a period of time, in some ways even forgiving other people that have caused harm to us. But so much of that involves sitting in that community and processing all that information. And for me, it let me identify wounds that I've experienced, as a kid, wounds that I've experienced, as an adult, things that I have not healed from, that are still a work in progress, as we all are in some ways. And so, and to be able to identify those things with a sense of just being present and focusing on my body and my breath in that given moment, knowing that I don't need to respond to that thing. So how I utilize that in the present is, again, I'm constantly working in predominantly white environments, and I know that. And I've also spent time to understand, what does trauma feel like in my body? And what does that particular feeling in my body, what is that associated with? Is that associated with neglect? Is that associated with abuse? I've learned to be able to identify those things and then just pause and be able to breathe into that given moment and not necessarily respond to that underlying emotion. But the more important part is, when you're able to do that, you realize that being triggered in that moment means that your body is releasing hormones and cortisol and it's experiencing level of discomfort that you have to treat at some point in time, right? So just like when you started this podcast, you invited people to acknowledge what this space is, and this can be traumatizing. So I would suggest to everybody on this podcast, whether you think this is traumatizing or not, find some place at some point today to do something that allows you to engage in self-care. Whether it's gone for a walk, whether it's journaling, whatever it might be, this conversation can be traumatizing because this will touch upon a bunch of different people in different ways. That's very real. And so for me, when I experience those moments, I acknowledge that. I don't ignore it. I don't run away from it. But then I make sure that at some point in time that day, I find time to take care of myself. That could be yoga, that could be walking, that could be calling my mom, right? Whatever I need to do, I make sure I take care of myself. So.
Awesome. Yeah. What can allies do? How can allies help create spaces, acknowledge and create maybe spaces within the workplace and spaces outside of the workplace that, as well, that that can help heal, that can help develop that healing space for this process?
Yeah, and there's and that's a great question, incredibly important. And there's several things that allies can do. Number one, which becomes incredibly important, is believe people. So many people have gone through so many different random events that sometimes they don't even acknowledge to themselves because it's so painful, right? So believe people when they actually do, tell you their stories. Don't guess them, don't question, don't say, well, what's the objective fact that was based on your race? Believe people when they tell you their story. And then, don't require people around you to, tell you the details of their trauma just out of curiosity, right? Because that in and of itself, can be very harmful, and in some ways it can be exploitive. Um, I would also suggest, really doing your own personal work, both outside of the workplace and inside of the workplace. And one of the reasons that becomes really important is there was an ACE study done. So ACE stands for the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and it was done by Kaiser Permanente. And what they did was they looked at 10 different types of trauma, including like physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and emotional neglect. And they did studies on the US population. And what they found was that 2/3 of the US population is dealing with one of these forms of critical trauma. And if you don't do your own work, if you don't try to touch upon your own trauma, regardless of what that source might be, when you're interacting with someone, you could be triggered, and your interaction with that person is based on the coping mechanism that you've developed to protect yourself when you're triggered by that traumatic experience. So what that ultimately does is it prevents people in the workplace from really having these honest levels of interaction, because we're often triggered. Like right now, we're all triggered in some ways because of heightened stress and anxiety, and we're interacting based on this space of I'm trying to protect myself, you're trying to protect yourself. And again, that prevents that real level of intimacy, and that sense of trying to protect yourself prevents you from actually touching upon your emotions, which will allow you to engage in self-care. And by not touching upon your emotions, it becomes easier for you to actually do harm to somebody else. It can be easier for you to actually ignore someone, or even in some ways, in the kind of Amy Cooper situation, you had a situation where one person was called out on behavior by a neutral rule. So you don't have a leash on your dog, and that can make somebody feel shame, embarrassment, or discomfort. So what's one way to mask that shame, embarrassment, or discomfort? What's a coping mechanism? Is abuse of power. So what do? You step it up, you abuse your power, you abuse white privilege. And then you take that person out of that moment, and they might not view themselves, as discriminatory, racist, or whatever it might be, But in that given moment, when they are triggered, you can do something like that to mask that underlying discomfort if you haven't done your own work. So we can do harm to each other very easily in the workplace if we all haven't done our own work. So allies, do your own work. Also, other small things like when people share something, listen. Don't necessarily kind of listen in a way that you're just waiting to give feedback. Act on what you've heard from other people. And there's just a whole variety of resources that's out there. That's for learning, that's for reflection, that's for growth. That we all need to kind of delve in and touch a little bit. But those are things that people can do in general in the workplace. And the last thing that I would say is don't rely on your ERG groups to do all the work for you. The employee resource groups can serve a huge role, but they're not there as an excuse for you to not do your own personal work. And then like one final comment on ERG groups is you have to be mindful of ERG groups. They're often a great resource, but if the members of the ERG group themselves have also not done their work, because we as African Americans, we need to do our own work as well, especially African American men. We often man up to each other. We don't show emotions. We need to do that. We need to show that level of vulnerability. But if the members of the ERG group haven't done their own personal work, there's an aspect where they could actually be displaying the same characteristics of people that are in power. So if you haven't done the work, those that are oppressed can engage in the same exact behaviors as the oppressor.
So where can people, you mentioned some resources already. Are there additional resources where people can learn more or are there, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A about resources for mindfulness practices. Anything you can recommend?
Yeah, I definitely recommend going to, it's called Niroga. It's Niroga. It's a yoga studio in Berkeley that focuses again on yoga, mindful, and meditation, the way to understand and release stress from the body. They have a ton of different practices that you can adopt at home. They have a ton of different trainings that you can do like just over a weekend. And then they have a whole list of different just reading resources that I mentioned one before, The Body Keeps Score, as a fantastic resource to kind of understand healing and trauma.
Awesome. Just looking at some of the Q&A, and if anybody else has questions, drop it in the Q&A here. Karen asks if you have a TED Talk. I agree, you need one. Linda just asks if you could cite the study on childhood trauma again.
Yeah, so it's the ACE study. So it's adolescent childhood. Let me find out, get that word for you in a second.
Yeah, and we can also, we'll share it out later as well when we follow up with this episode.
Yeah, so it's the Adverse Childhood Experience Study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente.
Awesome. Bonnie asks, can you talk about how one's culture impacts interaction? Now, it maybe, for example, she says making eye contact or asking questions, but are there particular things that you see in the workplace that that can trigger trauma from a cultural perspective?
Yeah, no, Bonnie, that's a great question, because and there's two things I'm thinking about. One is normative behaviors in a workplace, and two, the importance of creating an inclusive environment. So what do I mean by that is, often workplaces will have normative behaviors, which is behaviors that everyone is expected to conform to succeed within a given environment. So for example, a normative behavior could be everyone talks very directly to each other. If you have a question, you directly ask that question. and you directly answer that question. Whereas in other cultures, some cultures might communicate more in stories. And then and in telling that story, you get a given point across. So in that culture of direct communication, communicating more in a story could be perceived as being deceitful or lying and not telling the truth because you're not engaging in that normative culture environment. So that absolutely comes up in the workplace, that there's outside culture and then there's inside culture, which is important for inclusion because it's what inclusive. So it's important for companies to encourage inclusive behaviors, and inclusive behaviors challenges that normative culture by inviting in different perspectives. So inclusive behaviors are things like, you have a meeting, and to avoid people talking over each other, you set up a rule that we have a talking piece. And whenever someone has a talking piece, that person is talking, everybody else has to absolutely be quiet. And if somebody interrupts that person with talking piece, we're gonna hit a buzzer that actually kind of outs that person for doing so. That encourages an inclusive behavior, which makes everyone feel like my voice is valued, my voice is heard. The other thing that encourages inclusive behavior is if workplaces work on psychological safety, which is ultimately you create an environment where people feel valued based on their unique characteristics, that their unique perspective is wanted in the organization. And when you share that unique perspective, you do not experience any form of retaliation. That makes you feel safe. That makes you part of the organization and your unique perspective valued, versus it being this normative behaviors conformist culture.
And there's a question from Heidi, and I think that a lot of companies are grappling with this right now. How do allies invite a conversation in a way that won't trigger trauma or dive into details, but create that safe space, that psychologically safe space to have conversations, important conversations about this right now?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I'll share with you some ideas, because the direct answer is that it really is going to vary depending on your company and the culture that you have in the company. There's not going to be, if you apply a cookie cutter approach that you got from somewhere else, it's not necessarily going to fit. Because you have to kind of know your company, you have to know your people. But there's a couple of things that you can do. Number one, I would say absolutely just carve out space to do it. Don't do it as like, okay, we're going to have a luncheon, right? Where we're going to talk about, workplace trauma or people's trauma, and then we're going to go back to work, right? That can be traumatizing for me as maybe the African American in the office, that the entire day I'm thinking about, oh my God, I have to talk about this thing for an hour, and then I have to go back to work. And then after I've talked about something, I then have to go back to work. Carve it out as like a day. Carve it out as being a half a day. And then after you have your carve out space afterwards for people to heal. This might be an unpopular suggestion, but maybe give your employees a day off sometime that week after they've gone through this period of time where you've engaged in these critical conversations. And so when you've carved out that time or space to have these critical conversations, I would actually invite someone in that's a facilitator, that's actually is really informed by trauma-informed practices, that knows how to actually facilitate those conversations, right? That, I've been in plenty of meetings where someone starts the meeting by saying, this is a safe space. And then they go on into their agenda, right? Like, you haven't done anything that actually creates a safe space for people that are going to be traumatized, right? So bring someone in and that actually knows how to do that, right? And then the last thing that I would say is, if you have employee resource groups, reach out to them to get information as to, what are things that people that are more likely to be traumatized than others really need for this to be a safe space. And the last thing that I would say is, whatever event that you have, that it's time that you set aside, for these types of difficult conversations, take that feedback very seriously and find ways to implement that in the workplace that other people are fully aware of. That creates psychological safety because I feel like I have shared, you've heard it, you now have integrated that within the workplace environment, versus, you just have your event and then you go back to life being as normal. So hopefully some of those things were helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's the last question we'll take here from Jay. I know what Jay stands for, but I will. Jay, I'm a Black woman who's generally the only Black person in her personal and work circles. She's been struggling lately to cope with what's been going on, job hunting and interviewing on top of all of that. What can she do alone in her home to around mental health and stress relief and working through trauma?
Yeah, no, that's a really important and powerful question. I think it's something that, so first and foremost, thank you for sharing that question. It shows a lot of vulnerability and also shows that your willingness to acknowledge, kind of where you are. And it's not necessarily common within Black culture, particularly with Black men, that we actually do that. So give yourself some credit on that space. The first thing that I would do is reach out and try to form a community. Whether it is reaching out to family members, friends, church community, online groups that maybe are similar thinking. Reach out and become part of a larger community. Often when we're experiencing the isolation that we're experiencing now, and we're struggling, as African Americans to deal with so many different things, that sense of isolation and feeling alone can lead us to engage in a lot of self-harm that we want to try to avoid. So the most important thing to avoid doing that is to realize that you're actually part of a larger community. The other thing that I would start doing is just really begin to identify what are the things that bring you joy. What are the things that you can connect with that give your life meaning? There's a really good book called Man's Search for Meaning. It was written by Viktor Frankl, and I'll try to keep this short. So he's a Holocaust survivor, and he talked about how the people that survived the Holocaust were not necessarily like the smartest or the strongest or had the most education, but it was the people that could find meaning in their existence. And that's one of the things that's going to be important for you during this difficult time, is to find those constant reminders of meaningfulness, in joy. The other thing that I would do is realize that this is just a season that you're in. And I think it's hard to kind of, realize that when you're in that moment. But the idea is that if you can realize that you're the ocean, you can handle the waves, right? Right now you're in a wave, but you're more vast, you're actually the ocean. And find ways to kind of remind yourself of that. And don't give up. Don't give up. As blanking on his name, he's an African American playwright. August Wilson once said, "Life is hard, but it ain't impossible."
Michael, thank you. Really appreciate this. Appreciate going deep into this topic, and yeah, thank you. Thanks for doing the work you do.
Yeah, thank everyone for engaging in this conversation and sticking with the discomfort from this moment, because that's where growth comes from, is sticking with the discomfort and not escaping and not masking it. So I'm excited to see what comes out from all of this.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to end by saying that allyship is not just about learning. It's not just about having empathy and understanding. That's a part of it, but it's also about taking action. And we heard a lot of actions here. There's a lot of work we need to do inside ourselves, as well as work we need to do externally. So take an uncomfortable step forward, take a risk to correct centuries of oppression and privilege, and take action. You can start small, but do something.
Sure.
So thank you everybody for joining us today, and join us each week for Leading with Empathy and Allyship. You can sign up to attend live with audience Q&A like this, or you can catch the podcast or the video afterwards. And you can also stay in the loop by going to changecatalyst.co, changecatalyst.co, and signing up for our newsletter. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and our YouTube channel, and we will see you next week. All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Appreciate you all. Do the work.